President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. As my colleagues are no doubt aware, I stand in opposition to this bill, not because I think we should have insider trading. As a physician, I'm trained to fix the real problem, and you're treating symptoms. You know, several months ago, CBS did a series and showed some questionable, but not necessarily insider trading stock trades, which brought about, given our low level of confidence by the American public in this institution, has raised the question, well, what about insider trading? You know, I honestly believe everyone in our body is never going to use insider trading to advantage themselves over the best interests of the country. But the real problem is the confidence in the Congress to do what is in the best long-term interest of the country. And the reason that the confidence in there doesn't have anything to do with insider trading as we would normally think about it, has to do with insider trading that we don't normally think about it, on how we sell a vote to get something else out of the next vote, how we trade a position, how we saw positions were bought on the health care bill, whether it be the Cornhusker kickback or the Florida Gatorade or whatever it was. The fact is the American people saw behavior of members of Congress doing things that were politically expedient rather than what is in the long, best-term interest of our country. That's the real insider trading scandal that we ought to be addressing. Now, how do we do that? The way we address that is bring to the floor bills that actually address the problems that our country's having today. You know, every second of every day this year, our government will borrow $121,000. We'll spend $121,000, not borrow. We'll borrow $52,000 a second, every day. We're not addressing any of that in the Senate. We haven't all last year. We aren't this year. The real problem in front of our country is America doesn't see a Congress that's willing to address the real issues and make the hard choices. Hard choices are coming. We will make those choices ultimately. Some of us won't be here. But the longer we delay in making those very difficult choices, like saving Medicare, like saving Social Security, like reforming the tax code to stimulate economic activity and create job opportunities for Americans, that's what they want us doing. The other thing I would mention is I was one of two people who voted against the last ethics law. And I asked my colleagues, did we really improve the Senate with the last ethics law? Will we really improve the quality of representation with this law? I don't think so. I think what we're doing is playing a political game to say we're all guilty, now we have to prove that we're not. That's not what our system of law is built on. Our system of law is built on the fact that we're innocent until we're proven guilty. And the assumption that the Senate is undertaking now is that some of our colleagues are doing insider trading on the stock market. Nothing could be further from the truth. The real inside trading is the horse trading that goes on in this body that's not always in the best interest of the country. This legislation isn't about to earn back the trust of the American people. The SEC and the Ethics Committee already have the power to investigate inside trading abuses. We yearly fill out a report listing every trade we have made. Now, if it's true what the chairman of the committee said, that what the SEC would like to do is have it more refined so they can have better access, then that ought to be the bill that we bring forward. We ought to bring forward a bill that says we, number one, are under the laws of the SEC, Section 10B, and we are. You don't hear that said anywhere, but we are. If our intent is to bring forward a bill to fix the potential for insider trading, then that's what we ought to be doing. But the assumption that we're guilty first and have to prove we're not by making a notification every 30 days of any trade that somebody makes for you, you may not have even been involved, but you may have a fiduciary that you've asked to trade for you. And then you're going to have to make that representation. Has anybody asked the question, what happens if you do have inside information, have no involvement whatsoever in the trade because you put it in a trust account for you, but it's still being traded, and they happen to coordinate at the same time? Are you guilty of insider trading? Or are you going to spend $50,000 to $100,000 proving yourself that you're not guilty? This is a fine institution. It can be better. But it's best when it fixes the real problems, not the symptoms of the problems. Mr. President, I ask that unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside and that amendment number 1473 be called up.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report.
The Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and others, proposes amendment number 1473.
I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered.
This is a bipartisan amendment. This has Senator McCain, Senator McCaskill, Senator Udall from Colorado, Senator Burr, and Senator Paul, as well as myself. This is a straightforward amendment. We've had multiple times we've asked for this, but haven't gotten it. What this amendment says is every bill that comes before Congress and to be considered by the Senate, we should determine whether it's duplicating something that's already happening in the federal government. It's common sense. And all we're saying is an analysis by the CRS, Congressional Research Service, to determine if the bill creates a new federal program, office, or initiative that would duplicate or overlap any existing federal program, any existing federal office, or initiative with a similar mission, similar purpose, similar goal, or activities, along with a listing of all the overlapping or duplicated federal programs, or offices, or initiatives, or initiative. Now, why is that important? Last February, the GAO brought to us the first third of the federal government and outlined to us $200 billion worth of spending on duplicate programs. They gave it to us. It was hailed as a great thing that now we know we have all these areas. 82 teacher training programs, 47 job training programs, 56 financial literacy programs, and on and on and on. They brought that to us. And we all said that was good. The problem with it, we didn't do anything about it. You want to restore confidence in the Congress, do something about the problems that have been identified already. So what this is a good government policy says that before we act on a new bill, that we'll actually know what we're doing. And that we will have checked with CRS, and they will tell us, are we duplicating, again, something that's already happening out there? One of the other amendments that we should pass is to have every agency give us their list of programs every year. Do you realize that there's only one agency in the federal government, one department, who actually knows all their programs? There's only one. It's the Department of Education. They're the only ones you can go to and find out a list of all their programs. The rest of them don't know them. There's no catalog. They have no idea. So before we pass a new piece of legislation, we ought to at least have the help of the Congressional Research Service, and we ought to pass good legislation that doesn't duplicate. It may be a well-intentioned piece of legislation, but because we as a Congress have failed in our oversight responsibility, we don't know that it's a duplicate when we bring it here to the floor and pass it on the Senate. All I'm asking is, let's just do a double check, especially in time of trillion-dollar deficits, that we ought to double check and make sure that we're not duplicating something that's already happening. That's important for a second reason. If we don't know that we're duplicating something, that means we're not oversighting the thing that's occurring right now, the program or the office or the initiative that's out there now. If we don't have the knowledge of it, So rather than create a new program, it might actually give us the opportunity to fix one that was well-intentioned, but isn't working. So what this is a good government amendment. It's bipartisan that says, let's do this before we pass additional legislation. Let's know what we're doing. It's complete and it's thorough. It also will provide greater transparency for both us and taxpayers regarding the impact of the legislation that we're passing. Now, some may say, well, what if we have an emergency? This has a clause in it that says if it's an emergency, that requirement is waived. So if in a case of an emergency that we need to do something, we will waive the requirement that we have to look at CRS to see if there's duplications. So it's a common sense amendment. I would hope my colleagues will support it and that we can, in fact, actually fix the real problems, not the symptoms of the disease. Mr. President, I ask that the current amendment that's pending be set aside, and I call up Amendment 1474.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will report.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and Mr. McCain, proposes amendment number 1474.
Mr. President, this is another good government amendment. What this says, and if we want to restore confidence, this is something we should do. It says before we vote on a bill, we're going to have at least 72 hours to read it. It's going to be available online with a CBO score so that when we cast a vote, we actually know what we're casting a vote on and we actually know how much it costs. It just says it has to be online for 72 hours. In other words, we get the privilege of reading the bills we're voting on. And we also get the privilege of knowing the financial cost of the bills, or at least an estimate of the financial cost that they will entail. This transparency is designed to make the Senate better. You want to build confidence with the American public? Then the way you build confidence is assure them that you knew exactly what you were doing when you cast a vote, not guessing at what the consequences and the details of that legislation are. For many pieces of legislation, right now, what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years here, there was no time given, no capability to study the legislation, to make improvements, and many of the pieces of legislation came without the ability to modify it. You can't read the legislation and you can't amend it. What does that tell you about the legislative temperament and thoughtfulness of the U.S. Senate? You can't read it, you don't have time to contemplate it and consider it, and you can't amend it even if you could. That doesn't have anything to do with the U.S. Senate as it was designed and functioned for 170 years. It has everything to do with politics today rather than the best long-term interests of the country. Amendments like this have gained large amount of bipartisan support and have had support in the past when we voted on it. Although we haven't acquired the 67 votes that have been necessary in the past to pass this. Co-sponsor of this amendment is Senator McCain. He understands the importance of reading what we pass. All our colleagues do. Why not put the self-discipline in that we have to, rather than the political moment that says you got to vote on this whether you know anything about it or not? Eight of my colleagues during the health care debate sent a letter to review the health care legislation. 8 of my colleagues who ultimately voted for the health care legislation. And what their request was is give us 72 hours to read this. The legislative text and complete budget scores from the Congressional Budget Office of the health care legislation considered on the Senate should be made available on a website the public can access for at least 72 hours prior to the first vote to proceed to the legislation. Why shouldn't the public be able to see what we're doing 72 hours before we do it? And just as important, why shouldn't we be able to know what we're doing before we do it. So it's a straightforward, common sense, transparent to the American public, as well as to our colleagues in the Senate, that now you have the time available to read a piece of legislation, contemplate it, and hopefully have the opportunity to improve it. What's the goal? The best long-term outcome for the country. Mr. President, I'd ask that the pending amendment be set aside, and I call up Amendment 1476.
Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will report.
The Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, proposes amendment number 1476 to amendment number 1470.
Mr. President, this amendment would provide a complete substitute for the Stock Act. And what it does, it requires members and staff to certify that they have not used inside information for private financial profit. In other words, they're going to make an affirmative statement under the law that they have not violated Section 10B of the Securities and Exchange Act. All members would be required to sign the following statement on annual financial disclosure forms. I hereby certify that the financial transactions reflected in this disclosure form were not made on the basis of material non-public information. The Stock Act does not create new restrictions for Congress against insider trading. We all know that. Those restrictions are there. There's no new restrictions. We don't change the restrictions at all. The SEC has stated that the members of Congress and staff are already subject to insider trading laws. They just need some clarity with that. They also would like to have timeliness with that. In fact, all Americans are subject to these laws, including the Senate, found primarily in Section 10B. This provision restricts anyone who trades stocks from using material non-public information to profit financially, and Congress is no different than anybody else. The Stock Act was carefully written to simply reaffirm that Congress is not exempted from these laws. And I believe the chairman stated that just a moment ago, which we would include in this. As such, the bill brings no new reforms to the table, nor does it create any real expectation that behavior will change. It just requires a paperwork phenomenon. All members and relevant staff should have to certify they're not trading on private information. Each year, every member and certain high-salaried staff are required to disclose their financial holdings. Senate Rule 37 also already prohibits any senator or staff person from conflicts of interest. That would be a conflict of interest. Specifically, Rule 37 prohibits the receipt of compensation by virtue of influence improperly exerted from his position as a member or officer or employee. So we're covered doubly. We're already covered under Section 37, and we're covered under Section 10B of the Securities and Exchange Act. If, in fact, somebody fails not to do this, then they'll be liable under the False Statements Act in Title 18, Section 1001, which makes it a crime to lie to Congress. Section 1001 prohibits anyone from knowingly and willfully making any material, false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement to the government. The punishment for violating the False Statements Act is a fine and a prison term up to 5 years. This does not mean that someone who makes a good faith effort but mistakenly forgets something will face punishment. Yet any member who knowingly signs that form in error will be liable for making a false statement on his or her financing, carrying large penalties. I think efforts to reestablish trust in the Congress are important. I disagree with my colleagues that this is one that will make a difference. It won't. Nothing materially changes other than a paperwork requirement. Nothing materially changes other than every 30 days you have to report instead of annually. What is the real problem? The people of this country do not have confidence in Congress because Congress does not address the real issues of the country. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.